Okay, so now we made it to the next section where we're going to talk about while loops. In your career, you're going to have to occasionally write while loops, especially when you don't know what the input is coming from a user. So we're going to explain to you how while loops work. So if you're new to this channel and you're not a part of the cohort, the curriculum link is in the description and you're welcome to follow along with us. Like I said, it's a free resource. So let's get into the curriculum. So while loops. There is another JavaScript construct that can also be used for iteration, the while loop. The while loop provides a much more general mechanism for iterating. Like a for loop, it uses a condition to determine whether the loop body will continue to execute. Unlike a for loop, however, it does not have initial and updated expressions. So this is the body of a while loop. This is the syntax. A while loop will continue to repeat as long as its Boolean expression is evaluated to true. That's why just don't memorize the syntax, but understand what it does. And key word here, Boolean expression. What is a Boolean expression? Go back and look it up and make sure you understand what a Boolean expression is. If you know what it is, go ahead and leave a comment in the comments, or leave your answer in the comments. The conditions typically include a value or a variable that is updated within the loop. So that expression eventually becomes false. Flow of execution of the while loop. We can visualize the flow of execution of a while loop as follows. Here is the flow of execution for a while loop. Evaluate the condition which yields a value of true or false. If the condition is false, exit the while loop and continue execution at the next statement. After the loop body, if the condition is true, execute the loop body and then go back to step 1. For loops rewritten as while loops. We can use the while loop to create any type of iteration we wish, including anything that we have previously done with a for loop. For example, consider our initial for loop example. So remember when I told you earlier, let I assign it to 0, 0 assigned to I, however you want to say it. Then we have the condition right here. Now remember what I told you about that 51? If I want 51 to display, I have to put an equal sign behind the less than operator. And then we cancel log I. We cancel log I. This can be rewritten as a while loop. Check out while loop example. We have the example for you to check it out inside of VS Code. And then this is the location where you will find it. Now here in the while loop, we do it a little bit different. Let I is what we call global. It's outside of the scope of the while loop. So here we just need just the condition only. And then inside the code block, we add the console.log and then we increment by 1. That's the basic syntax of a while loop, but you have to understand how it works. It still gives us an initial variable, but it's, like I said, it's not within scope of the while loop. It's outside the scope of the while loop. Now, instead of relying on the initial and update expressions as we do in a for loop, we must manage the state of our loop manually. To do this, before entering the while loop, we will create the variable I and initialize it to 0. The first number we want to print. This variable plays the same role as the loop variable in a for loop. Every iteration will print I and then increment I to the next value until it reaches the value 51. The loop continues to iterate until the condition I less than 51 evaluates to false, the same as a for loop. You can almost read the while statement as if it were in a natural language. While I is less than 51, continue executing the body of the loop. What happens if we forget to include the I++ at the end of the while loop? So if you forget to add it, play with it and see what happens. All you got to do is open up your console. Beyond the for loops, we stated earlier that a while loop are more flexible than for loops. Now we will look at an example that illustrates this. This program is an example of input validation. It prompts the user to enter a positive number and convert the input string to the number data type. If the number is not positive, then the user is prompted again within the body of the loop. As long as the user continues to input non-positive numbers, the loop will continue to iterate. So here we go, got our read line sync. You're gonna have to open this up in VS Code to run this. So we let num input question, please enter a positive number. Then we create another variable that's going to, well, we have the same variable, now we're just updating it to include the num, so we can store it in num, whatever the input is. Now notice here, again, JavaScript is what type of programming language? You remember what type of programming language it is? The type of programming language that goes line by line. Put your answer in the comments down below. Let me know what type of language so we can understand how this is going to work line by line to get the result we're looking for. Now this is stored in num. So while num is less than equal to 0, then it's going to run this code block as long as it's less than or equal to 0. So you ask the question, invalid input, please enter a positive number. So every time it's less than, which would be a negative number, anything less equal or less than 0, you need the number to be more than 0. It's going to keep prompting you to enter a positive number so that this will work, this code will work properly. Now, this example illustrates the additional flexibility provided by while loops. While we use the loop for loops to iterate over fixed collections, a string, an array, a collections of integers, the while loop can be used to iterate in more general circumstances. For the input validation example, at runtime, it cannot be determined how many times the loop will repeat. Infinite loops revisited. It is easier to create an infinite while loop than an infinite for loop. To see this, consider what happens to our first while loop example if we forget to update the loop variable. Here it is right here. If you already played around with it, you already know what the result is going to be. This is an infinite loop. The variable I is initialized to 0 and never updates, so the condition I less than 51 will always be true. If you ran this program, you will see a never-ending list of zeros. Why? Because you never added the updater function or the updater part, the I++, to continue to update it. And remember, it has to be within that scope in order for it to work. Okay, now, one of the things is you saw it was an infinite loop, so it can run out of resources and it'll just stop or crash, or you can just stop it from running. So just be mindful when you're reading these things and you're looking at it. Think like the compiler. Is this going to equate to true? This is why it's so important to understand what it does. Don't just memorize the syntax. Even when we remember to update the counter, we must be careful to make sure that the condition will eventually be false. Like this decrement, it's not going to ever be false. It's always going to be true because we're not incrementing, we're decrementing. In this case, I negative decreases the value of the counter. Since I starts at 0 and I is less than 51, it's always going to be true. If you ran this program, you will see an ever-expanding list of negative numbers. At some point, everyone creates an infinite loop. When that happens to you, type Control-C will usually force the program to stop. Okay, so we made it to the end of this section. Check your understanding. Again, understand what it does. Break it down. Remember, it has to be true. We want to get to false with loops. And so whatever condition that you're giving it, as long as it's true, it's going to keep iterating. So you want to make sure whatever code you write, that it always have a fail-safe to reach false. Okay, so we made it to the end of this section. That's the end of this video. I'll see you in the next section. And remember, the more you do, the more you improve.